Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, September 26th, 2021, and today we're going to be talking about Senator Chuck Grassley from the state of Iowa, who is now announcing that he will be running for re-election in this state. Now, the reason why this is so significant is because Chuck Grassley has been long awaited and long expected by the Democratic Party to choose to retire in this upcoming Senate year. The reason being his old age and the length of which he has been in the United States Senate. When you take a look at the state of Iowa, we now know that the incumbent is running. But if you take a look at Chuck Grassley's electoral history, you might not expect him to run for re-election. He's been serving in the United States Senate after first being elected coinciding with President Reagan's first term in 1980. That means he has been in the United States Senate for over 40 years as of January 3rd, 2021, which means if he is elected, he will go on to serve for a total of 46 years, and then maybe he will choose to retire at that point in time. Or, technically speaking, he can run for re-election as long as he wants. If you're taking a look at his electoral history beyond the Senate, you might also be surprised to note that he has been a part of the Iowa delegation for a very significant period of time. He was actually a member of the United States House of Representatives from 1975 through 1981. In addition, he served in the Iowa House of Representatives from 1959 through 1975. Now, that is super significant, mainly because that means for as long as the state of Iowa has been around, Chuck Grassley has been in office for a third of the state's entire history. Put that into full perspective. He has been serving since 1959 from the state of Iowa in some capacity, which means he has been in office for over 60 years, whether it's the Iowa House, the actual House, or the United States Senate. Quite fascinating if you ask me. And now that he's running for re-election, this only continues his long-lasting legacy across the United States Senate, and it also benefits the Republican Party in a very significant way. And I'll show you what I mean. When you take a look at our current Senate map, you might note that I just made a mistake. I understand that. I will go back to fix it in just a moment. But if you take a look at our current Senate delegation, you might notice that there are a significant amount of Republicans choosing to retire in 2022. That total number actually up to 5 at this point in time, which could have been 6 if Chuck Grassley chose to retire. But instead, he's opting to run for re-election, which means that the other senators who have left it to be open and up to interpretation might be inclined to speak on the issue right now. The first senator that we are going to be looking at in terms of retirements are actually the 5 in total. Let's not break it down any further than it needs to be. We have Pennsylvania Senator Pat Toomey, Ohio Senator Rob Portman, North Carolina Senator Richard Burr, Alabama Senator Richard Shelby, and Missouri Senator Roy Blunt. But Iowa was a widely expected retirement expected to be added to the GOP's ranks of falling out senators. In addition, the state of Wisconsin, we don't know which direction that one's going to go in terms of Republican versus Democrat, but also the Republican incumbent has not yet announced whether or not he is choosing to run for re-election. In addition, we are waiting on Lisa Murkowski in the state of Alaska and Patrick Leahy in the state of Vermont. As it stands currently, not a single Democratic senator has chosen to retire. The only one we don't know officially that will be not running for re-election or running for re-election or not, pretty much the only one we have no idea yet is Patrick Leahy, where we actually do have a bit of an idea, an inclination that he's going to be running for re-election, as he has already hired a campaign staff, and we can pretty much expect it to move on from there. But if he chooses to retire, Vermont is Vermont. It's not going to be competitive by any regard. But now that we have an assurance in the state of Iowa that the Republican Party is going to have an incumbent there, that puts the Democratic Party in a more unfortunate position. Because as it stands now, even with 5 Republican retirements, I personally expect the GOP to reclaim the majority in the United States Senate. Now, the reason why I've been holding out on Iowa in terms of making it a safe state is, number one, personally speaking, when you take a look at the numbers, I did not expect Chuck Grassley to hold such a large lead as he does now. In addition to that, if you take a look at the voter sentiment, originally they did not want him to run for re-election, but it doesn't seem like they have a problem with it considering the new opinion polls that show him up 18 points against a top Democratic contender. And in addition, an open race is always more competitive than a race with an incumbent unless that incumbent is just insanely unpopular. Chuck Grassley is quite the opposite. In fact, he won his most recent election in 2016. If you want to take a look at previous elections, let's go back to 2016. He won that race by a very large margin of 24.4%. In fact, neighboring states, one most notably, the state of Missouri, went to Roy Blunt by only 2.8%, despite Iowa going to Trump by 9 in 2016 and Missouri going to Trump by 17 points. Yet, the Senate results were very much flipped. So looking at the state of Iowa, Chuck Grassley has always had a very, very strong history in this state. In 2010, in this election, we can actually take a look here. You can see that in the 2010 midterm elections, that Chuck Grassley was able to win in the state of Iowa yet again by 31 points. You go back to 2004, he wins by 42 points. It doesn't matter when you look, the state of Iowa is always red for Chuck Grassley, and that's why this is so beneficial for the GOP, because it is no longer a state that they need to even remotely worry about at this point, and that does deserve to have a safe Republican characterization at this point in time, especially given the national circumstances. But another implication of him choosing to run is that it might pressure other Republicans to choose to run as well, most notably Lisa Murkowski, and even more notably, Ron Johnson from the state of Wisconsin. When you take a look at Ron Johnson's website and the way that he has, unfortunately for the GOP, not hired a campaign staff, you will see that it is, number one, outdated on the website, and number two, that it just doesn't look like he's going to run. When you take a look at the Senate election in the state of Wisconsin, Ron Johnson has already decided that he is going to be waiting it out and telling and pushing it out further and further and further. And the endorsement from President Trump, I think, should have been enough to push him over the edge if he truly was on the fence about it. But Ron Johnson made a commitment back in 2016 that he was not going to run for re-election. When you take a look at the news or the blog post, I don't know if we can find it here, they might have removed it for obvious reason. But Ron Johnson made a commitment that he was going to retire from the United States Senate if elected for a second term. He was an outsider. He had no political experience before running, challenged the incumbent Russ Feingold. Russ Feingold came back in 2016 to run against him again. And this website is still stuck on 2016. Now, the reason why that is so significant is because at this point in time, Democrats are already fundraising. They are already ramping up for an extremely competitive election year, which means to tell us that Ron Johnson probably isn't going to run for re-election. But Chuck Grassley's choosing to run might push him over the edge. He has already been called on publicly by President Trump to run for re-election. He has been called on publicly by Rick Scott, the chairman of the the Republican Senate National Committee. I'm not entirely sure. It's the NRSC, National Republican Senatorial Committee. That's the right term for it. He has been publicly called on by Mitch McConnell to run for re-election. Top Republicans around the nation know that an incumbent in Wisconsin will fare better than any type of Republican nominee in an open race because people will vote for the incumbent. That's just how American politics works. 80% of the time, Senate incumbents win re-election. 90% of the time, House incumbents win re-election. So Ron Johnson would probably have a much better chance than many of these other Republicans that potentially could be running. Yet he's holding out for a reason. More and more pressure is going to build on him the same way it did on Chuck Grassley. Republicans wanted Chuck Grassley to run for re-election. He will be 89 years old in 2022. Another concern I would say, though, for the GOP that they should worry about is that if Chuck Grassley needs to retire, the same way Johnny Isakson did, it will prompt a special election in the middle of the term. What does that mean? Well, it gives the opposition party an opportunity yet again in a hotly competitive state, like the state of Iowa. For instance, let's take a look at the Senate elections in 2020. Why am I bringing it back up? Well, if you remember, Georgia had 2 Senate races. Why, might you ask? Well, in 2016, Johnny Isakson ran for re-election and won. He won by 13 points on the same ballot. Donald Trump won by 5. It was a very large victory. He got about 18% of the black vote, so it was a very significant victory, and Republicans were happy with that. He ran for re-election. It was a non-competitive race, whatever. Now, 3 years later, fast forward, 2019, he announces that I am going to retire, and thus prompts a special election. Now, for a significant period of that time, nobody really thought that Georgia could go to a Democrat on the Senate level. There was only a consideration of that on the governor level after Stacey Abrams, but the presidential level still seemed out of reach for Democrats. They would have had to have shifted the state by over 5 points. They did that. And the Senate election, that individual one, would have had to shifted over 13 points to the left. And guess what? It shifted 15 points to the left. But that doesn't really matter. The point being, looking at the results in the state of Georgia, had Johnny Isakson not ran for re-election and another Republican took his place, there absolutely would have been a Republican incumbent. No Democrat would have won in 2016, and yet that would have prevented the Democratic Party entirely from reclaiming the Senate majority. Think about that for an instance. Had Johnny Isakson not ran for re-election in 2016, the Democrats would not have control of the United States Senate. It's sort of like the butterfly effect. And of course, there are other what-if scenarios. What if Sarah Gideon had won in the state of Maine? What if Tom Tillis had lost in the state of North Carolina? All of these scenarios can be brought up fairly, right? But Georgia specifically, this special election would have never even been in play. This election wouldn't even have been up until 2022. Except for, it was the wrong race. I meant to say Raphael Warnock's race with Kelly Loeffler. I don't know why I chose the John Ossoff and David Perdue race. That was obviously the wrong one. I do apologize for that mistake. I hope it doesn't change anything about the point. But looking at what happened here, this special election would have been up, or this regular election would have been up in 2022, not a special election, and would have prevented, ultimately, the Democratic Party from taking control. So Iowa is a bit of a concern just in that regard, that Chuck Grassley might choose to retire early the same way Johnny Isakson did, saying that health reasons are a reason why they can no longer serve. Chuck Grassley honestly seems to be in, top-notch health right now. I don't think that is a concern that the Republican Party is expecting to happen, but then again, unforeseen circumstances can absolutely happen the same way it did for Johnny Isakson in the state of Georgia. But this definitely is boosting the Republican Party's chances at winning back the majority. CNN, Chris Cillizza, says that Republicans just got some great news for 2022, and that is absolutely correct. Looking at the state of Iowa, this is a state that the Democratic Party was targeting briefly. In the Democratic Party, you can see here that I do not know exactly how to pronounce her name, but she's a former United States representative, first elected in 2018, lost in 2020 against a Republican here. Her name is Abby, I think, Finkenauer. I believe that's how you pronounce it. If I am wrong, please correct me in the comment section down below. I definitely want to get names correctly. But just essentially, she was running. She is running. And she is going to be challenging now, it seems, Chuck Grassley in the state of Iowa for the United States Senate race. Now, that is actually pretty significant. She was someone who was deemed as a very strong candidate, could have won a statewide race, but potentially against a Republican that isn't Chuck Grassley. His influence, his name recognition, his popularity is too much to allow a Democrat to win this race. And looking at the ratings, solid Republican, solid Republican, solid Republican. And what is the only poll that tells us? Seltzer and Company, and the reason why I choose this one as maybe the gold standard of Iowa is because they actually got Iowa exactly correct in both 2016 and 2020 in terms of the margin for President Trump. And they are predicting that Chuck Grassley, based off their poll, it's not an actual prediction, it's just they have polled Iowa correctly in the past, and they are telling us that Chuck Grassley will win this race by a margin of 18 points. A margin of 18 points against probably one of the best Democrats that they could have ran in this race. No Democrat will make this race competitive. We know because Chuck Grassley is running that it will be very solid for the GOP, and this probably is an understatement. Because if the state of Iowa is no longer a worry for the GOP, no money needs to be funneled into that race. They can now focus on states such as Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, New Hampshire, prime targets for the GOP. They can take advantage of Iowa no longer being a competitive state, and it wasn't really in the first place. The only reason why is because when you take a look at the presidential results, you see that Donald Trump won by 8 points. He won by 9 points in 2016, but in 2018, Iowa came within 3 points of going to the Democrats on the governor level. Democrats were able to reclaim 3 of the House seats there. The Republican parties won. In fact, they nearly had 4-0. Nearly 4-0, and I kid you not, that was a very real possibility. They only lost that 4th district by just a few percentage points. Donald Trump won that 4th district now by over 20 points. So you can see that sometimes in midterm years, it doesn't go the way that you would like it to, especially in some of these states where it might seem as if, off surface level, of the presidential results, that it won't go to the Democratic Party or won't go to the opposition party, but it can significantly narrow up. The same way we are seeing the state of Virginia, which went to Joe Biden by 10.1%, narrow up in this governor's race to a point where Cook Political Report actually has just made the state of Virginia a toss-up state in the governor level. So looking at Iowa, this might have been a target for the Democratic Party, but I don't think so anymore. They know that based off 2016, based off 2020, that they will not do well in this state. And this only adds to the GOP's already high expectation of reclaiming control of the United States Senate. For a period of time, Democrats actually had the lead over the GOP. But then the approval rating for President Biden started to dip and dip and dip to a point where now the expectation of Democrats to retain control of the United States Senate is at 48 cents for a yes share. Republicans are at 55 cents as a chance of reclaiming control. and reclaiming control is much more difficult than retaining control. When you have room to fall, which Democrats arguably do not, but I will say that they still have the majority and they still have that advantage when it comes down to the lack of retirements in the United States Senate, and yet Republicans are still pulling ahead, that is significant. That is the start of a warning sign, at least, of a red wave year for 2022. Do I think it will be a wave year? Not at the moment. I don't think it's going to be some type of red tsunami like we saw in 2010 or 2014, but it is absolutely possible. I'm not counting it out at all. I'm just saying as of right now, that's not what I see based off the numbers. But all in all, Democrats should absolutely be worried because this Iowa development boosts the GOP chances by a pretty significant amount. If they're not spending tens of millions of dollars in Iowa, they're spending it elsewhere. And considering how close many of these presidential election races were, they should be very worried. Wisconsin was decided by a margin of 20,000 votes. Georgia by 12,000 votes. Arizona by 13,000 votes. Margins matter. And just a couple extra $1 million in an individual race can go an exceptionally long way. And based off the House results, Democrats know that best. Every single toss-up race went to the GOP. And yet some of them were decided by exceptionally close margins. 0.03%. Less than 0.01%. This margin right here was decided by 6 votes over nearly 400,000 cast. How fascinating to see how close the elections were. And interesting that the GOP pulled ahead and just shows that they almost always will win these toss-up races, and considering 2022 is expected to be a better year for them, if I was a Democrat looking at these numbers, I would be very worried as it stands today. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.